Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. Yeah, today we are making a Chinese dish called Moo Shu Pork. I feel like Moo Shu Pork is pretty common. Most folks know what it is, but if you're not, I have seen it referred to as a Chinese taco because it's essentially like a wok fried vegetable stir fry that's wrapped in, I think most traditionally in what's essentially like an egg roll wrapper. More commonly in America, because those wrappers are a little bit hard to come by, I have always grown up eating it in a flour tortilla. So very commonly you will see it referred to, especially in like Americanized or Westernized Chinese restaurants, as Chinese tacos or something to that effect, or Chinese wraps or something, or yeah, something like that. Today I'm making in particular a specific version of Moo Shu Pork called Hecai Daimao, which I learned from my mother, who told me that it's technically not Moo Shu Pork. It's essentially a veggie stir fry, but in particular includes the use of vermicelli rice noodles. And that's the version that I always grew up eating. I don't think I ever ate Moo Shu Pork in a restaurant. I always ate the only time I ever ate Moo Shu Pork was when my parents made it. And that version always contained rice noodles, so vermicelli. So I'm going to take a shot at making that version today. If you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the comments. I don't know everything about Moo Shu Pork or wok cooking or Chinese cooking in general, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful and informative, or at the very least entertaining to watch. As with most of the things that come up when we cook stuff on stream, there's usually a recipe video that is either already published or will be published very soon on my YouTube channel. So some folks are already watching on the YouTube channel right now. And if you're already over there, then you're already on the YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/WuCanCook. If you're watching on Reddit, it's the YouTube channel that's at the bottom of the screen. And that's usually where I will post the associated recipe video that comes along with whatever we're cooking on stream today. Today we actually don't have a recipe video out for this particular Moo Shu Pork because we're actually filming the recipe video right now. So assuming that I don't mess it up, that will pop up on my YouTube channel probably in another week or so. And I made this a few times. The previous version, previous time that I made it, I did a more traditional Moo Shu Pork, which does not contain vermicelli rice noodles. So today I'm taking a shot at the version that my parents have always made for me, which is Hecai Daimao, which contains rice noodles, part of my Chinese. It's very, very poor. Yeah, assuming that I don't mess this up, it will probably pop up as a recipe on my YouTube channel within the next week or so. So hopefully I don't mess it up. So if you're not already on the YouTube channel, or if you're already on the YouTube channel but haven't subscribed, I definitely recommend bopping over there and checking out some of the recipes because they're fun to watch. Lots of people like to watch me cut stuff and cook. I've been told that my voice is very relaxing. So, but lots of fun recipes, especially if you're particularly interested in reproducing what we're cooking on stream today, or in general, anything that I cook on stream, because pretty much everything that I cook on stream will eventually have a recipe video, if it does not already. That's always going to be on the YouTube channel. So, lots of fun content over there. Okay, so to start with our Moo Shu Pork, I'm starting with, as with most of the things that I cook, with 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic, followed by some finely minced ginger. I finally have some fresh ginger today, so if you noticed, it looks a little bit brighter and then a little bit like more hydrated than the older ginger that I was cutting up probably over the last week. It's still okay to use older ginger, but it's a little bit drier when you chop it up. So when your ginger is fresher, you really don't need to peel that skin off because it's not as chewy as older ginger. I still peel it anyway, mostly because I didn't clean it. But when you have fresh ginger, you definitely can totally eat that skin. So I'm just giving my ginger a pretty fine mince here. And that should do it. Right, so the reason that we start off with ginger and garlic with so many recipes is because ginger and garlic tend to be two of the foundational elements that we use for building out umami. So anytime we're cooking anything that's particularly savory, especially in Chinese cuisine, we very, very frequently will start off with the use of ginger and garlic. Not necessarily because we're trying to impart the flavor of ginger and garlic, but really just because it's kind of a foundational element that we sort of build your castle on top of ginger and garlic. So. Right, so moving on, I'm going to start chopping up the veggies. So a Moo Shu Pork, if you've ever had it in a restaurant, can look very, very differently depending on who cooked it. It's one of those Chinese dishes where really depending on what restaurant you're in, what chef you're eating from, even like where in the world you are, it can vary and pretty widely depending on many, many factors, especially in America, because Moo Shu Pork is definitely a super Americanized dish. So that means that what a Moo Shu Pork essentially is a mixed vegetable stir fry that's generally sautéed in a wok, and then generally contains some amount of scrambled egg, so like an egg pancake generally on top. More commonly, I've seen the egg done as like diced or sliced, and then so like wok fried egg, wok fried scrambled egg. And then sliced into strips and then thrown into like the stir fry. The version that we're doing today, which is called Hecai Daimao, which literally translates to veggies with a hat on it, the hat being our egg. So today we're going to do kind of a different type of Moo Shu Pork because it contains, the way that it's plated looks a little bit different because it doesn't have strips of egg worked into the vegetable stir fry. It just has an egg topper or an egg hat, which is the literal translation. The other main element that we're changing today is that our recipe today contains the use of vermicelli rice noodles, which is the version that I'm most familiar with. But other than that, what a Moo Shu Pork is essentially just a vegetable stir fry. So if you don't have all of the exact vegetables that I'm using today, that's okay. Just riff off of whatever happens to be in your refrigerator. So I'm using carrots, green onions, bean sprouts, and cabbage. But you can really just use whatever you have. So if you've got some bell peppers, throw some bell peppers in. If you have zucchinis or green beans or whatever you got, throw it in, because that's essentially the general ethos of how a stir fry works, or especially how a veggie stir fry works, is use what you have. So. Alright, so for my carrots, I'm giving these a julienne cut. We want to be careful about making sure that we don't have any large chunks of carrots in our stir fry, because you could end up with undercooked vegetables, which is not what we're after. We want to make sure thin strips of carrot going on so that they cook evenly. So that means that we have to be very careful about making sure that our julienne cuts are actually julienne cuts and not planks, which is annoying because the julienne cut is really frustrating to do. But I promise that it's worth it. Alright. Am I a professional chef? No, I am not. There are definitely professional chefs on Reddit bopping around. I am not one of them. I just cook stuff at home a lot. I'm actually a professional musician. I play music for a living up until about March of this year, and then COVID-19 happened. And then everything disappeared, so the whole band has been shut down since March. But up until then, I was playing in a band called Trace Repeat. We're a funk band out of Oakland here. And then when COVID happened, we didn't have anything to do for like almost an entire year now. So I started this channel to cook stuff, and that's where we're at now. I should be, yeah. That's very nice of you, and I appreciate that. That's very flattering. But I'm definitely, I guess I know lots of stuff about cooking, because cooking is just one of those things that comes super naturally to me, which is super rare for me. But I definitely do not have the temperament to like keep up with a professional kitchen, and I definitely have not gone to culinary school. So But also just in general, I don't think I could handle it in a professional kitchen. That sounds like super high stress and like not really what I want to do. So, but I definitely appreciate that so many people think that I could be a professional chef. That's neat. But you definitely, like, in order to have the title of chef, that's like a thing that you have to like earn and go to school for and like kind of be qualified for and stuff, which is definitely not me. I'm just a guy that cooks at home a lot, I guess. But yeah, well, so when COVID-19 happened, we started this YouTube channel, or I started this YouTube channel. There's no we. Called Woo Can Cook, which is loosely based off of a PBS cooking show from the 90s called Yan Can Cook, run by a guy named Martin Yan. Martin Yan's thing was that he would cut stuff really, really fast with a giant cleaver and then not look, just like stare deadpan into the camera with a goofy ass smile on his face. So that was a cooking show that I used to watch a lot when I was a little kid. Definitely one of the handful of cooking shows that I grew up watching a lot of. So when I started this cooking show, I wasn't really thinking that much about like branding. It was mostly just a funny name that I thought of. So here we are 6-7 months later, and it's a Reddit channel and a YouTube channel. So that's fun. My career has taken a very strange turn. You've seen that dude? Yeah, Martin Yan. Martin Yan, I don't know what he's up to lately. I haven't seen him like do anything lately. And like the last time I saw him on air was probably in like maybe the late 90s or maybe the early 2000s. But Martin Yan was one of a handful of chefs that was cooking on PBS at that time. The other one that I can think of off the top right now is a guy named Ming Tsai, who ran a show called Simply Ming. Ming Tsai is definitely still active and doing lots of cool shit. I know that he has done a few collaborations with Kenji Lopez, which is super fun. And just like generally keeping an eye on what Ming Tsai is doing is super fun. I know he had a restaurant that was open in New York that I think is gone now because of COVID. I know he had something else, and I can't remember what, but he was doing some cool stuff. Right, so that's our carrots. That's maybe one of my best juliennes in a while. Lots of times I'll do a julienne and then I'll get lazy, but I actually think that was not bad. I guess it has to do with how committed I am to making sure my julienne looks good. Make a sandwich, yeah. Been thinking about making a banh mi on stream. That would be fun. But I don't know how to make a banh mi, so I have to figure out how to do that first. Let's see, let's do these green onions. So, next I'm going to chop up some green onions. My green onions are not as fresh as they could be, but that's okay. So I thought I would show you guys what to do with green onions when they look this way instead of just cleaning it up before I showed it to you. So green onions, lots of times if you buy it and you don't eat it within a day or two, they start wilting, so it looks like this. So you kind of get stuff like this where the greens sort of like wither and kind of start falling apart. That's fine. Lots of people start throwing away their green onions when they start seeing that, but you don't need to do that, and it's also kind of wasteful. Just pick it off and then set it aside. What I like to do is set it aside and then freeze it and put it in like a Ziploc bag. So I have over here it's a Ziploc bag that's filled with all of the food scraps that I'm cutting up right now, and then I'm going to throw that in the freezer, and then once it's full I'm going to throw it into my stock, which I'm making right now, and I can show you actually. So this is my veggie stock. This has been boiling on the stove pretty much all day, and essentially what it is, actually literally what it is basically a big pot of garbage water, because it's basically just every scrap that I have cooked or cut over the last, like, I don't know, maybe a month or so, and I just throw it in that Ziploc bag, and then once the Ziploc bag is full, I'll throw it into a big stock pile along with maybe like 1 or 2 bones of beef bones, and then we'll boil it up, and then that is what is essentially beef stock. So don't waste your food scraps. Just throw it in the freezer, and you can totally use that stuff, especially with green onions, because green onions are great for stocks. So anytime that you have like a veggie that is appropriate for a stock, So I do the same thing with carrots, celery, cabbage, green onions, any kind of onions really. So purple or white onions. Really, almost any veggie. The only things that I like try not to throw into my stock bags are like things that have a particular flavor. So I avoid throwing my jalapeno stems in there. Cilantro stems are really great. Really, any kind of veggie, it'll work great. And it's a great way to reduce food waste. Okay, so today I go back and forth on how to use green onions in a Moo Shu pork, but I think today I want to incorporate them in larger planks. So I'm gonna go for pretty large slices of green onion here. So we're gonna go for about half-inch pieces here. We don't need to be super careful, but just about there. And that's going to have a lot of bite and chew in our final dish, which is going to be super appropriate because our final dish is essentially going to be a big pot or a big plate of stir-fried pork and veggies. So that will work out really great. I have also gone back and forth on maybe separating your green onions and then leaving the greens as a garnish. But I ultimately lean against that because there's no real point in throwing a garnish on top of a Moo Shu pork, because the Moo Shu pork is already like a whole big mess already. So there's no point in trying to make it fancy because it's not going to look fancy. It's a big plate of veggies and noodles. So. Oh, cool. Yeah, you're going to bop over to YouTube. YouTube is super fun. We have a couple folks that are watching over there. It's a little bit like cleaner because there's a little bit more room to mess around on OBS. Yeah, let's do these. Hello to everyone just joining. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. Today I'm cooking a vegetable stir-fry called Moo Shu pork. I feel like Moo Shu pork is a pretty well-known dish, but if you're not familiar with it, it is essentially a vegetable stir-fry with pork that we eat and wrap in, most traditionally wrapped in like a really thin skin. I guess like most similar to like an egg roll skin. Today I'm doing it in a flour tortilla because that's actually how I've most typically eaten Moo Shu pork, because those Moo Shu skins are a little bit hard to find. But really anything will work. I've also done it in corn tortillas and it works just fine. But because of that and because of the way that it's often consumed in America, you might more commonly see it referred to as Chinese tacos, which is a really silly name. Or like Chinese wraps or Chinese vegetable wraps, Chinese pork vegetable wraps, something like that. So I see those names thrown around a lot. All of those are basically what Moo Shu pork is. Today, the version of Moo Shu pork that we're making today is a version called Hecai Daimao, which is something that my mom revealed to me because the version of Moo Shu pork that I have always eaten as a kid, I don't think I've ever eaten Moo Shu pork in a restaurant. The only version that I ever had as a kid was the version that my parents made for me, and I realized a couple weeks ago when my mom told me that that's actually not Moo Shu pork. Because the version that we're making today, which is called Hecai Daimao, literally translates to like mixed veggies with a hat on it. The hat being a scrambled and then wok fried egg, and the egg is our hat. So we're going to stir fry some veggies and then top it with an egg, scrambled egg on top. Which technically, and the last thing that it also includes is vermicelli noodles, which is not something that you typically will find in a Moo Shu pork. So what we're making today is actually not Moo Shu pork. It's kind of something different, although you do still put it in a wrap. But it's the version that I always knew as Moo Shu pork because it's the version that my parents always made for me. So I always just assumed that that was what Moo Shu pork is, but in actuality, it is not at all Moo Shu pork. So. If you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the comments. I don't know everything about wok cooking or Moo Shu pork or stir frying, but I guess I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative or at the very least entertaining to watch. If you're particularly interested in recreating what we're cooking today, I recommend hopping over to the YouTube channel where there's lots of fun content, including most of the time the recipes that I'm cooking today. Today we're actually filming the recipe for the YouTube video right now. So assuming that I don't mess it up, sometimes I do mess it up, and then we have to redo it. But assuming that I don't mess it up, usually a recipe video will also come along onto the YouTube channel within another week or so. The YouTube video for this particular recipe should be out on YouTube pretty soon. Along with many other things, yesterday we did I forgot what we cooked. Oh, we did a Westlake soup, which was the recipe that we released yesterday. So I released a recipe for a Chinese Westlake soup, which is essentially an egg drop soup. That popped up onto the YouTube channel yesterday on Friday, and then we kind of cooked our way through it. And generally, anytime we're live streaming something, I will do my best to announce what we're going to be cooking beforehand, so you can cook along with me if you like. Otherwise, it's also just a really great resource for finding the recipes for pretty much everything that I cook. So if you're particularly interested in recreating what we're cooking today, I definitely recommend hopping over to the YouTube channel and checking some of that stuff out. We're working our way to a 1,000 subscriber goal by the end of December, which is the bar at the bottom of the screen, and I'm pretty sure we're going to hit it. Pretty sure we'll make it. It kind of depends on how often I stream. Yeah, okay, so moving on, I'm rehydrating these are black fungus mushrooms. Most commonly when you eat moo shu pork, you will find the use of wood ear mushrooms. I couldn't find any wood ear mushrooms today, or maybe I didn't really look, but this is what I had on hand. And black fungus is really, really similar. Basically, essentially what it is a really large, kind of looks like pig ears. And it almost feels like cartilage, and what we're going to do is rehydrate it in some boiled water. So this is hot water that we're rehydrating. They are really, really thin, so they hydrate really quickly. They're pretty much already hydrated at this point. And we're going to let that come up into a tender mushroom, and then we're going to slice that into strips. So the goal is, as with pretty much everything that we're chopping up today, is to make sure that all of our veggies are in a pretty similar shape and size, and that's to make sure that everything cooks evenly. For our wood ears, or these are actually black fungus, I'm going to pull these out. These mushrooms are always super crazy to me because they look insane. And then we're going to cut into strips here. And that is it. Right. So I'm going to set this aside. Basically what we're going to do, you'll notice that pretty much the first 3/4 of what we're cooking today is basically just chopping stuff, because there's a whole bunch of veggies that are going into this. We want all of that chopping to be ready to go before we start cooking. So. Next, I'm going to do some cabbage. I much prefer doing this with Taiwanese cabbage, which is a little bit more tender. Today I'm using, this is just plain old Napa cabbage that I had bought to make some kimchi, and then I never got around to making the kimchi. But I'm going to try and use it up today. So today we're doing it with Napa cabbage, which will work just fine too. It's a little bit wilted, so I'm going to pull off some of the pieces. And this is too small of a knife. I love taking out the big knife anytime I can. This is the big knife. I call this the big boy. This is a nice 16-inch butcher's knife. And I don't know what else to use it for unless I'm chopping up a really, really large vegetable, because I don't do any butchery work. But I love taking it out anytime I can, though, because that's super fun. What an absurdly large and unnecessary knife to own. Healthiest takeout options are. I guess that kind of depends where you live. In the Oakland area, my preference is for super healthy. I would probably go Mediterranean first, so anything hummus or Mediterranean based. And that's mainly because there's lots of veggies in that cuisine. And then after that, the next thing I would go for is probably Vietnamese food, which is of the Asian cuisines, probably the lightest one. But really, honestly, takeout is generally a crapshoot anyway. Good question, though. I do have eaten at many of the like restaurants in Oakland, so very frequently that actually brings to mind that I should mention. Very frequently when I do recipes, you'll find that I'm recreating a recipe for some restaurant in Oakland. So the Westlake soup recipe that we did yesterday was a recipe based off of a restaurant in San Francisco that's not there anymore. It's called Dragon House. I think next week we're going to be releasing a video for Pad See which is based off of a Pad See for a restaurant here in Oakland called Nicha Thai. Lots of times, many of the recipes that I do are probably based off of some form of the dish that comes up in a restaurant that's somewhere in or around the Oakland area. So that tends to be like the quality of anytime when I do a recipe. If it's not an effort to like copycat something from Panda Express or from TV or film, it's probably in an effort to copycat some kind of recipe from some restaurant somewhere in Oakland. All right, so I'm chopping up this cabbage. It looks like a lot of cabbage, but I promise that it's not. Remember that cabbage is mostly water. So once we throw this into the wok, it's going to reduce probably by like 3/4 of the volume, maybe even more. All right, so I'm washing my cabbage, and then the next thing, this is very important anytime that you're working with a leafy green, is that we're shaking out as much of this water as possible. We don't want any of this liquid to get into our wok. So before we're ready to throw it into our wok, we want to shake it dry as much as we possibly can. So if you have a salad spinner and you are really committed, I'm not going to get my salad spinner out today, but a salad spinner would be smart for this too. And the point of all of this is to make sure that all of this moisture doesn't end up in our wok, because you'll probably have heard, if you've watched these streams, you'll know that I say this all the time, but the big enemy of wok cooking is moisture. So the more moisture that ends up in your wok, the more problems you're going to have with heat retention. So as more moisture builds up, the temperature of the wok starts dropping rapidly. And as you get a colder and colder wok, you start wandering into the area of building up a stir fry that's very mushy and like soggy. So very frequently, if you've eaten a stir fry and it kind of looks and has the consistency of like oatmeal or like soggy cereal, that's because the wok wasn't hot enough. So because you didn't have the wok hot enough. And I have for sure made many stir fries that were mushy. And that's because if you're not careful, that's what happens with a wok. So lots of people are worried and scared of cooking on a wok at home because they're worried that without the super high heat that you get in restaurants, that you're not going to be able to make a good stir fry because you won't have enough heat. That is absolutely not true. But we do have to approach the way that we cook a little bit differently because we don't have that super high heat. And the main way that we do that is through a process called batch cooking. And the process of batch cooking is, as you noticed, we just chopped up a whole bunch of veggies, and all of that is going to go into our wok at some point. But instead of doing all of those things at once, what we're going to do is cook certain elements and then remove it from the wok. So while we're cooking it, the wok is very hot. So we're going to start with probably our pork plus our aromatics, so garlic and ginger. So we're going to flash cook that on really high heat for about a minute or two, and that's because the wok is very hot. You really don't need to cook it for very long. And then once that is cooked, we're going to remove it from the wok and then allow our wok to get hotter again. And then once the heat builds back up in our wok, we're going to add our next ingredient in and then repeat that process. And then the only point where everything will be in the wok is at the very end when we combine everything. And at that point, we're really not cooking anything anymore. We're really just combining. So the end result is that when you cook on super high heats but remove everything, every element that you're cooking has the opportunity to cook in really high heat. So you still get the qualities of flash cooking without creating a super mushy stir fry. All right, so next I'm going to do some bean sprouts. I guess I could show you. I had to go out and pick up some fresh bean sprouts because if you are not careful about bean sprouts, they turn into this. And that's because bean sprouts are basically just water. It's filled with water. So as you Keep these over time. I think these are probably about a week and a half old. They start to turn into, look, this looks really gross. And that's because eventually that water just seeps out of the bean sprouts. We don't want that to happen, so you try and use up your bean sprouts within about a week or so. So probably the same thing is going to happen with these bean sprouts again too. And I'm probably going to have to end up throwing away about half of it, which is a real bummer. But do your best to make sure that you use up as much of your bean sprouts as possible. Okay. That's my day. Yeah, thanks for asking. Pretty good. Lately, like, the big highlight of my day has been streaming for you guys, so this is super fun. As entertaining for me as it is entertaining for you, I think. Alright, so I'm going to do the same thing with my bean sprouts as I did with my cabbage. I'm giving them a rinse just to make sure that they're clean. I'd also do that with some fruit wash too. And the same thing, we're shaking out as much water as possible here to make sure our bean sprouts are as dry as we can possibly get them. And then we're going to set these aside too. Yeah. All right, so next up is some, this is a bamboo shoot. These look really crazy, so I should definitely talk about them. If you can't find bamboo shoots, generally if you live near an Asian market and you go to the Asian market, they will generally have this stuff, and it will look like this. And this is the root of a bamboo shoot that's been boiled and then peeled. So then once it's boiled and peeled, that's essentially removing all of the impurities and stuff. And it comes out and it looks like this. And when you go to a Chinese market, generally you'll find it looking like this, which is pretty crazy because it looks super weird and kind of like a monster egg. But if you can't find it, if you can't find fresh bamboo shoots, the next best thing that I would recommend is you can find this stuff in a can. And if you can't find it in a can in the market, I'm sure that you can find this stuff in a can on the internet somewhere. Fresh bamboo shoots, super great if you can find it. If you can't find it, just leave it out. I found that water chestnuts are probably the next best substitute, but then if you can't find either of those things, really just substitute it with whatever vegetables that you have. Right. So for our bamboo shoots, I'm approaching, this is going to be pretty similar to how we approach carrots. I'm going for a similar slice. I'm not going to be as fine with our julienne as we were with our carrots, and that's because these bamboo shoots are a lot more tender than our carrots, so I'm not as worried about them undercooking. So we're just going for strips here. I know that I have made this at least once before with canned bamboo shoots, which is pretty similar, honestly, so if all you can find is the canned version, it's just fine. That is our bamboo shoots. Okay. Anything else? Let's do our eggs. I know I'm definitely using a lot of veggies, or some veggies that some folks can't find, but I hope the general takeaway from this is that a moo shu pork is really just a vegetable stir fry with a couple extra steps plus pork. So if you can't find everything that I'm using or any of the things that I'm using, you can honestly just use whatever vegetables that you have, and it will be the same thing because it's really just a vegetable stir fry that we're doing. So. Don't be intimidated if you can't find every ingredient that I'm using today. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to do before we move on to our sauce is our eggs. So I'm going to be doing, this is going to be 3 eggs today, and we're just going to do a quick whisk on these things. And this is going to be the last thing that we throw on top of our Moo Shu pork, which was, I guess, the hat in the vegetable with a hat on it. So the Chinese name for what we're cooking today is called Hecai Daimao, which is definitely not the best pronunciation, but it literally translates to mixed veggies with a hat on it, the hat being our eggs. So we're going to stir fry a bunch of veggies and pork and then cover it with a scrambled egg, and the hat in this case is our egg. So. Okay. The last thing that we're chopping up today is our pork. This is pork loin. Actually I almost always do it with pork loin, but if you can't get your hands on pork, really any kind of meat element will work. So you could totally do this with beef or chicken too, and that's going to be just fine. Although I will say that pork is definitely the most tasty option here. So as with everything else that we've chopped today, our goal here with our pork is to make sure that our pork is chopped in a similar shape and size as everything else. So I'm going for pretty small slices here, kind of similar to the general shape and size of almost everything else that we chopped today. So the same shape and size as our carrots, our cabbage, our bamboo shoots, all of it. So. Do I think certain cultures make more unhealthy food? That is, yeah, definitely true. There's definitely certain cuisines in the world that are unhealthy, less healthy than other cuisines, particularly American cuisine is in particular super unhealthy. But also Chinese food is not always the healthiest thing, so. But I guess it really depends on what you're eating, for sure. Right. Hello to everyone just joining. I keep on introducing myself more often. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. Today we're cooking a Chinese dish called Moo Shu Pork. I feel like most people know what Moo Shu Pork is because it's the name of the dragon from Mulan. But if you're not familiar with Moo Shu Pork, it's a vegetable stir fry that has eggs and pork in it that we wrap in, I guess, like an egg roll wrap, or more commonly in America, a flour tortilla. That's how I've always eaten it, is in a flour tortilla, which leads lots of places I've seen refer to it as Chinese tacos, which to me is a really silly name, but if it helps you identify what it is, I guess it works. If you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the comments. I don't know anything about Moo Shu Pork, but I guess I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful. If you're particularly interested in recreating what we're cooking today, almost everything that we cook on stream either has or will have soon a recipe video that goes along with it. So there's no recipe video for our Moo Shu Pork today, but there will be pretty soon, assuming that I don't mess it up. There will be a cleaner and more thought out narrative for this recipe. And that will be up on our YouTube channel, which some folks are already watching on, which is youtube.com/WuCanCook. That's the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen if you're watching on Reddit. And that's where almost everything will have a recipe video that comes with it. Those are out every Friday. So yesterday we did a recipe for a Westlake soup, which is a Chinese egg soup with a couple of extra steps involved. Before that, we've kind of been making our way through pretty much all of the food from Panda Express. We also did a sweet custard bun from Legend of Korra. Just generally exploring lots of foods from various places and cuisines, mostly like Asian or Pan-Asian. Lately, we've been digging into investigating how Chinese American food looks, so that's why we've been doing so much Panda Express stuff. It's because I love exploring like the way that Chinese American food looks and how it's so different from Chinese food, because Chinese American food is definitely not Chinese food anymore. It's just American food, which doesn't mean that it's not tasty. It's just not Chinese food. So I love looking at like things like Panda Express and kind of exploring what happens when it becomes American food. Why does it look the way that it looks? Why is there so much sugar in Chinese American food? Why does Panda Express, why does everything in Panda Express foods have like sauce in it? And like what's that all about? So it's sort of like the way, in my opinion, the way that Chinese food looks when it became American food is just like taking the elements that that Americans love, which is like sugar and spiciness and like savoriness, and then turning all of those things up to 11 and like cranking all of those elements up and exploiting all of these things that American people love for the palate of the American palate. So I've been kind of like exploring how to reproduce some of those recipes, and then doing maybe, usually when we do a Chinese American food, I'll do a second version that is like a little bit more traditional, kind of removes some of those those American qualities and replaces it with more traditional Chinese elements. And seeing what a really iconic Chinese American dish looks like, so like sesame chicken or kung pao chicken or General Tso's chicken, and seeing what that dish would look like if it was done in a traditional Chinese setting. So content like that's all up on the YouTube channel. So if you're already there, I recommend checking some of that stuff out. If you're watching on Reddit, I recommend bopping over to the YouTube channel if you're interested in cooking stuff yourself. That's at youtube.com/WuCanCook. All right. So we're not quite done chopping yet, so I'm not going to clean my board quite yet. But I am going to rinse it down, and then we're going to do our quick marinade for our pork here. Oh yeah, thanks for watching. 45 seconds, cool. Yeah, this is definitely, I guess it's entertaining for 45 seconds. Yeah, I'm glad I have a passion for cooking too. All right, so for our marinade, I'm not going to get super complicated with our marinade because we are adding quite a bit of things in our sauce already. So I want to be careful not to overwhelm what our marinade contains already, because we want most of our flavors to be in our sauce. But I'm going to start with, that's 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, and this is going to be 2 tablespoons of Shaoxing wine. And then I'm going to add, this is a single tablespoon of sesame oil. No. Empty. Again. And then the very last thing, which I think is the secret ingredient to Chinese food, is going to be a pinch of MSG. Lots of folks ask me whether or not I use MSG in my cooking. I generally don't. Today I'm going to use just a tiny bit because I feel like I'm leaving out enough things that it might call for it. But very frequently you will see me leave out MSG entirely. And that's because a lot of the times the things that I'm adding to what we're cooking already contain either MSG itself or sometimes just qualities of ingredients that already have many of the things that we get from MSG, which is namely umami. So I'm sprinkling, this is going to be a couple pinches of MSG. And we're going to be, you want to be sparse with that stuff because it's very heavy. But definitely when you use MSG, essentially what you're mimicking are qualities of umami. So that means that anytime you're using something that has umami in it already, you are stacking on top, or you're doubling down. So when we're using things like soy sauce, or we're going to be using oyster sauce, we're going to be using hoisin sauce, doubanjiang, all of those things already contained quite a bit of umami already. So when we use MSG, it's doubling down on top of it. So I think in this case it's going to be okay because we're actually not using too many things today. But very frequently you will see me leaving out MSG, and I feel like it's okay to leave it out if you have all of those elements going on already. But if you don't have every element that I'm using for your sauce, definitely a good shortcut is MSG. So, and I have heard many people say that MSG is not good for you, which I guess is like technically true. Salt is not good for you either, but many things that we eat is not good for you, but you still eat it, you know. Out of bowls. Let's do this. All right, so the very last thing that we're going to do before we move over to our stove is assemble our sauce. So super frequently when you see wok stir fries come together, especially in like restaurants or even in like street food, you will see this part just go straight into the wok. So very frequently you'll see chefs skip this part and then just go straight into the wok, and then when it's time to add sauce, they'll just dump that stuff straight into the wok. Oftentimes with like a soup ladle or some kind of big spoon, and they'll just spoon that stuff straight in. And the reason that they can do that is because they make the same thing like 20, 30 times a day. Probably more than that, especially if it's like a street food restaurant. So since I'm not making it 20 or 30 times a day, I'm not as familiar with what we're doing, which means that we need to be a little bit more conscious of everything that we're adding. So I like, when I do wok stir fries, I like doing my sauces off heat beforehand, and that gives me the opportunity to taste and control over, have a little bit more control over the way that our stir fry is going to taste. So I can stop before we go over to the wok, taste what we're doing, pay attention. Is it too salty? Is it too like bright? Does it not bright enough? Does it need more vinegar? What does it taste like? And then we can adjust before we get onto the wok heat. So I'm starting our sauce. That's going to be 2 tablespoons of soy sauce. This is going to be 2 tablespoons of fish sauce. Sorry, not fish sauce, this is oyster sauce. Oyster sauce is derived from the fermentation of oyster, as the name implies. If you are trying to stay vegetarian, you can either skip this, or you can definitely find vegetarian oyster sauce. Lots of folks ask me if it's okay to substitute oyster sauce with hoisin sauce. That's mostly because they look similar, but they're definitely very, very different in flavor. So I would not substitute those. But if you can't find oyster sauce and you are not vegetarian, I'd say the next best thing is fish sauce, because it has that fermenty fishiness that comes with fish sauce. So what we're going after is not that like sweetness that you get with hoisin sauce. What we're really after is the fermented umami that you get when fish starts fermenting. So I like either using, if you can't find oyster sauce, either if you can't find oyster sauce, either fish sauce, or if you can't find that either, the next best thing in my opinion is anchovy, which serves a pretty similar purpose in Italian cuisine. Oftentimes I've seen, lots of times you'll see the use of anchovy in like marinara sauces or like pizza sauces, and that's to build out a little bit of umami in the sauce. So same quality, same level of fermentation, just a different cuisine. All right, next this is going to be a little bit more than that. About a tablespoon of doubanjiang, which is Chinese fermented chili paste. Again, if you can't find doubanjiang, the next best thing I will always recommend is gochujang, which is very similar but comes from Korean food. If you can't find either of those things, miso paste is probably the third best option. All of which come from the fermentation of some kind of bean into a paste. So that's why all of them are not necessarily interchangeable, but very, very similar though. Right, so next up, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of Shaoxing wine. If you can't find Shaoxing wine, I always recommend substituting that with dry cooking sherry, which is very similar and also more readily available in America too. And last, this is 2 tablespoons of rice vinegar. And then I'm going to give this a stir until it's combined, just to make sure everything is broken down. And then give it a taste and see what it needs. It's a little bit sweeter than I'd like it to be. It needs a little bit of salt. And I'm going to say a little bit more soy sauce. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so I think that's it. We're ready to cook stuff. Why the wine? Yeah, that's a great question. So Shaoxing wine, as the name implies, is a type of wine. What we're getting from it are those alcoholic fermented qualities. So again, the same reason that we use things like soy sauce. So what you get from it is like a little bit of brightness from the alcohol, but also a tiny bit of sweetness too, because it's made from, it's essentially a dry sherry. So for the same reason that you use dry cooking sherry, it's adding a little bit of like brightness and color. So it's the third addition that goes beyond like sweet and like savory, is that like bright umami. So I like oftentimes will either pair or use interchangeably rice vinegar. So rice vinegar, Shaoxing wine, not the same thing, but fall into very similar categories in my mind of like flavor and taste. So when you pair them together, they create a nice like I guess like a stereo picture of what like flavor palette you're going for in there. So I love pairing those two things together. But if you can't find Shaoxing wine, probably a good substitute would be rice vinegar, with a tiny bit of sugar though. Yeah, fermentation super important in like Chinese cooking. I feel like in most wok cooking. Yeah, red wine, probably not red wine. I would say maybe like white wine with a... White wine would probably be a weird sub, but it would hypothetically get you a similar result. In my mind, the use of Shaoxing wine is very similar to the use of white wine in Italian cooking. But it's definitely not the same thing. But if this is the only thing that you can get your hands on, white wine, for sure. If not that, then definitely dry cooking sherry. I think in America, dry cooking sherry is pretty easy to find. But if you can't find that, if not rice vinegar, then white wine would be my next bet. Cool. All right. Heading over to the stove. On our stove, my wok has been preheating for about like 15 minutes now. We want our wok to be as hot as it possibly can get. This is going to be true pretty much any time that you wok cook. No, there's no such thing as a bad comment. Please continue to comment. I love questions. And also, if I miss any questions, feel free to repeat your questions. I oftentimes will miss questions, mostly because the stove is this direction. So when people ask me questions and I'm facing the wrong direction, lots of times I'll miss stuff. So feel free, if I didn't answer your question, feel free to repeat it too. Yeah, so for wok cooking, anytime that you're cooking on a wok, you want to make sure that your wok is as hot as it possibly can get. And that's so we can do the process of a long yao. So a long yao comes from Chinese cooking. And it's the process of adding cold oil to a hot wok. And what that does is creates a really nice non-stick surface for us. So if you add cold oil to a cold wok and then heat both of them up together, what you end up with is a very sticky surface. So oftentimes in like restaurant cooking, you will see the long yao done with huge amounts of oil. So like an entire cup of oil. What oil are we using? That was grapeseed oil. Most commonly is probably peanut oil. But super commonly, you'll see that long yao done with like an entire cup of oil, and then they'll pour out most of the oil. And that's because they're eventually going to use all of that oil because they're cooking huge volumes. Since we are not using that much volume, we're not cooking in that volume, I have found that a long yao works just fine if you do it with just the amount of oil that you're going to be cooking with. So we're cooking today, that's maybe 4 tablespoons of oil. And then we're giving it a nice long yao, which is a nice swirl. And then we're ready to cook. Where's my spoon? It's right here. All right, so to start, I'm going to be using my aromatics. So this is my garlic, followed by my ginger. And then we're giving this a toss in our oil just long enough until it becomes fragrant. So that should take maybe 15 seconds, maybe a little bit less. Just long enough until you start smelling garlic and ginger. So use your nose at this point, pay attention to what you smell. When you start smelling garlic and ginger, you have your nice aromatics have released all of their aromatic flavors. So then I'm adding my pork next. I'm being careful to withhold as much of that marinade as possible. If you're really committed, you could dump the marinade first. I'm not going to do that though. Again, for the same reason that we strain all of our veggies after we rinse them. What we're after is just moisture reduction in our wok. All right, so I'm gonna let that go for about another minute or two, just long enough to get a good flash cook. We don't need it to be all the way cooked because we are going to be doing more cooking later, but yeah, we are trying to get as much of a flash cook on there as possible. Do I own a restaurant? No. I consider doing that with some friends, but there's a lot of like health and safety code that you have to clear if you want to try and cook for the public from your home kitchen, and then it just became super complicated and eventually ended up being a no-go. But that would be super cool eventually if I could get a license to do something like that. We were gonna try and like sell food over like Instagram. All right, so that is just about there. All right, so I'm gonna remove my pork at this point and repeat the process. So that is our pork. I'm pulling it off of our heat and setting it aside. So this is the process that we refer to as batch cooking. And batch cooking is essentially cooking certain elements, then removing it and restarting. So the big downside to batch cooking that I have run into pretty commonly is that when you cook in batches, you have to rinse all of this stuff out because you don't want to leave any of that residual fat and stuff sitting back in your wok, because what will happen is that's eventually going to burn, and then you're going to end up with burnt pork, which is not good. So the downside to it is that what you're rinsing out is essentially a whole bunch of flavor. So we just rinsed out a bunch of pork fat, which is not great because that's a lot of flavor. But you really, really don't want to leave that stuff sitting in your wok because it's eventually going to just burn. This is not quite hot enough. But that's definitely one of the trade-offs with batch cooking, is that you have to remove stuff from your wok, which means that you have to remove some of that fat. But essentially we're saving most of that when we pour out the wok though. All right, so I'm gonna let my wok come back up to temperature. That will take maybe another 15 to 20 seconds, just to make sure that our wok is as hot as it possibly is, as hot as it possibly can get. We want to make sure that we have as much heat as we can in our wok before we move on to our next ingredient. So we remove our pork, and then we're moving on to our next veggie. Throw it all in together, yeah. So that's like, I guess, part of the process of batch cooking is we don't want to throw everything into the wok all at once. So at no point in time should every element be in your wok, because what happens when too many things are in a wok is it causes the temperature of your wok to drop. So when you have really, really high heat, like restaurants do, that's generally okay to throw all of those things in because those restaurants have really, really big jet engine burners. And those burners are pumping out more BTUs and heat than most home burners are able to do. That makes it more difficult to keep that high heat retention in your wok, and that's because woks have very, very thin metals. So unlike a cast iron pan or a sturdy bottomed like skillet, those skillets have really, really thick bottoms, and what those thick bottoms are doing is retaining heat for you. A wok does not, you can see. It's really just a thin piece of carbon steel. So because of that, it has two qualities. What it allows us to do is it reheats very, very quickly, but it also cools down very quickly for the same reason, because it's very thin. So if we throw too many things in at once, the temperature of the wok is going to start dropping, and that's when you start getting things like mushy and like oatmeal-y qualities to your stir fry, which is not what we're after. I run into that problem all the time when I do things like fried rices or noodle stir fries, and I do them incorrectly because I put too many things into the wok. That has happened to me all the time, especially when I'm like working on a recipe and I'm working out the kinks. That definitely happens to me all the time. So we want to be careful about making sure that we don't overload our wok. So by employing the process of batch cooking, which is like throwing certain elements in and then removing it, we make sure that everything that is being cooked on super high heat. Great question, though. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing. So this is a long yao one more time with grapeseed oil. And then we're moving on to our veggies. What am I going to start with? I'm going to start with my cabbage. All right, so you want to remember that cabbage is mostly water. That's what makes cabbage have so much volume, and that's why it's so large. Is because it's mostly water. So when you throw the cabbage in, what we're paying attention to is making sure that as it starts seeping out water, the heat of our wok stays hot. So when you hear this. So this sound, when you hear that sound, which is all of that sizzling, that means there's plenty of heat going on. But as you hear the wok start reducing and you hear all of that sizzling starts to disappear, that's a sign that you don't have heat in your wok anymore. Also could be a sign that you're not burning water anymore. But in this case, we want to pay attention to that sound, because if you stop hearing that sizzling, that means that you don't have heat in your wok anymore. So if you find that there's no more sizzling, stop what you're doing. It's okay, but what you need to do is stop tossing your wok, because what you do when you toss your wok and you toss these veggies and you go like this, is it causes the heat or temperature of your wok to drop slightly. So we do a couple things in wok cooking to regulate heat temperature, right? So that's essentially to avoid things from burning. So when we toss, or when we do this, essentially what we're doing is dispersing the heat a little bit. So the more that you do that, the more temperature you're going to lose in your wok. So if you find that your wok is not hot enough, just stop moving it for a minute and it will reheat. That's a great quality about woks, is that they heat up really quickly. So if you run out of heat, or if there's not enough heat in your wok, just stop moving it for a second. All right, so I'm adding my carrots in. Followed by my bamboo shoots. Ooh, that's a little bit too much water. That'll be okay. All right, so you can definitely hear it now. The sizzling in my wok has suddenly disappeared, and that's because I just put a whole bunch of things into the wok. So if you listen, you can tell that that sizzling is slowly dissipating. So even after I toss, you can hear it has just dropped even more. So there's less and less sizzling happening. That's a sign that the heat is not dispersing anymore. So what we want to do is stop moving it, let that heat come back up. But eventually what will happen is we're running out of heat. So that means that we need to start removing stuff. So we're about at the point where we need to remove stuff from the wok again and do another batch cook. So, but before we do that, I'm going to add a couple spoonfuls of our sauce. So this is going to be maybe 3 tablespoons of our sauce. And this is going to help us get a nice dispersion of flavor across each element. It was a bamboo shoot. If you can't find bamboo shoots, I would just leave it out completely. Or if you can get your hands on it, usually I find more readily available are the canned bamboo shoots, which I usually find a little bit more commonly. But generally you should be able to find, if you live near an Asian market, you should be able to find bamboo shoots. They are definitely a crazy looking veggie though. How did I learn all this? Just a lot of like cooking, I guess. Just like a lot of researching, mostly from my parents. Lots of times what I'm cooking are probably some replication of what my parents used to cook. So the version of Moo Shu Pork that we're cooking today is the version that my mom used to make, which technically is not Moo Shu Pork. It's a dish called Hecai Daimao, which literally translates to mixed veggies with an egg on top. which is why we're stir frying our veggies, and then we're going to top it with a scrambled egg, which is the process of egg on top. But that's the version of Moo Shu pork that I used to eat when I was a kid, which was the way that my parents always made it. Later I found out that that is actually not what Moo Shu pork is. It's another dish entirely. Where am I located? I'm based out of Oakland, California. Right. So that's about there. I'm going to remove this. And let's see, what else do we have? Actually, you know what? I only have one more thing. Last thing I'm going to throw in is actually our mushrooms. And that's going to be the last thing. So I'm being careful here because I'm noticing that there's not a lot of heat in my wok at this point. And that's because we have so many things in the wok right now. So I'm paying attention very carefully about like how much heat is being dispersed. I'm listening very carefully to like all of that sizzling. When I start hearing all of that sizzling disappear, I need to stop moving the wok because we're running out of heat. So we're right at the cusp of having a soggy stir fry. I don't think we're in that neighborhood yet, but if we added anything else here, I think we would have that problem. Right, that should do it. Right, so same thing, I'm going to remove this from my wok and set it aside with our pork. In my first generation, I don't really know what first generation means, but my parents migrated here from Taiwan when they were kids, which I guess would make me second generation? I'm unclear on what that term means. But hopefully that answers your question. My parents immigrated here from Taiwan when they were teenagers. So I think that makes me first generation, but I'm honestly not clear. I found that in like the Asian American community, no one seems to know what that means. All right. Cool. Okay, so same thing. I'm going to do the exact same process again. We're removing everything from our wok. We have this nice non-stick surface, so I actually don't need to wipe anything out. I just gave it a rinse, and then we're letting our heat return to our wok by reheating our wok one more time. And the very last thing that I'm going to do is our eggs. So I love a good wok fried scrambled egg because it is super different from any other kind of scrambled egg that I've had because it's done on extremely high heat. Right. So if at any point you're not sure whether or not your wok is hot enough, the best way that I've found, usually when I have researched, when I see other folks do this, they do it with chopsticks, but really any kind of wooden utensil will work. So what I like to do is do your long yao, take your wooden spoon or chopstick and touch the oil. When you see, when the wood hits the wok, what you should see in the oil is a lot of sizzling. So you should see bubbles sizzling around your spoon or your chopstick. If you don't see those bubbles, that means that your wok isn't quite hot enough. So give it a couple more seconds to make sure that it is ripping hot before you start cooking again. Am I going to throw? Yes, so we're going to throw everything together at the very, very end. And that means that this is actually a little bit too much oil. So I'm going to pour a tiny bit of this out. And we're going to do our eggs. So here's our egg going in. So this is the process of a wok fried egg is pretty similar to me in my mind as the way that you approach an omelet. What we're after here is not curd, so we're not looking for fluffy eggs here. What we're looking for is a nice, I guess, like an egg pancake. So similar to the way that you do an omelet in a nonstick, we're going to let all of that egg make contact with the wok as much as we possibly can. And then kind of let it, just give it a good sizzle. So let it hang out for a second, and if we're really good, so let's see. All right, one more time. This works maybe 30% of the time. 1, 2, 3. Yeah! Don't try that if you've never used the wok, though. That's really scary. Okay, so I'm gonna let that go for another minute. Not a minute, maybe like 20 seconds. What we're looking for is some nice browning. And that should be it. All right. So, yeah, I love a good wok fried egg because, in my opinion, a wok fried egg looks nothing like any other kind of egg that I've ever had. That's because it's done on super, super high heat without any flipping or turning in any way. Also, I love doing a good fried egg, so like a good over easy egg in a wok. Because you get super lacy, super crispy edges, similar to the way you could do the same thing in a skillet. But because you have so much high heat and you have a nice amount of oil in your wok, it's a really great way to do a really lacy, really crispy egg. So, back over on our cutting board, I'm just going to make sure that this lays flat. And if we were doing a proper moo shu pork, what we would do with this at this point is chop it up and cut it into strips. I'm not going to do that today, and that's because the version that I'm doing today is technically not moo shu pork. It's called Hecai Daimao. We're going to use this as the topper to our vegetable stir fry. So instead of chopping this up and adding it as a garnish, I'm going to add it on the very, very top, and it's going to be the last thing that we add to our stir fry. All right. Back over on our wok. Looks like I got a little bit of water in our wok. I'm going to do one more long yao. I'm adding just a tiny little bit of oil. Remember that all of the things that we have just cooked and set aside also have quite a bit of cooking oil in them. So don't add too much cooking oil to your wok here because we're about to add all of those things back to your wok. So in goes my veggies, followed by my pork. And then the last two veggies that I have not yet added, which are our green onions and our bean sprouts. You'll notice that I did not do any stir frying with our green onions or our bean sprouts, and that's because I want those to be pretty crispy here. So I'm not actually going to give them very much time in the wok at all. They're just going to be essentially a garnish at this point. We really want those to be pretty raw here. So if you listen carefully, you can tell that there's really no heat in our wok at any point. So if at any point while you're cooking, you hear this happen in your wok, so if you hear your wok and it sounds like this and there's no sizzling happening, that means that there's no heat in your wok. So that's okay for us in this case because we're done cooking. But if we were still cooking and our wok sounded like that, that would be a big problem because that means that you don't have any heat left, which means that you're on your way to a super mushy stir fry. So I'm adding my sauce into the wok here. And then I'm going to give this maybe a minute, just long enough for a little bit of that moisture to cook off. It's a little bit looser than I'd like it to be without all of this liquid going on at the bottom. I'm going to give some time for that to cook off, and then we'll be ready to eat. 4 a.m. Yeah, this is definitely a good thing to watch at 4 a.m. You should definitely eat dinner at 4 a.m. Suck it, why not? All right. Hello to everyone just joining. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. Today we're doing a Chinese dish called Moo Shu Pork. If you are not familiar with Moo Shu Pork is essentially a vegetable stir fry with a couple things added, mainly pork. The particular version of Moo Shu Pork that we're doing today is actually technically not Moo Shu Pork. It's a dish called Hecai Daimao, which is the version that my parents always used to make for me. I think my mom was the one who made it. And I found out recently when I was talking to her about this that the version of Moo Shu Pork, oh, you know what, that we forgot. The version of Moo Shu Pork that I'm making today is technically not Moo Shu Pork. It's something completely different. Real quick, because I forgot, I'm going to throw together some vermicelli rice noodles. So the last thing that I'm going to do, over on a cutting board, is boil up some rice noodles. So this is vermicelli. Vermicelli definitely does not belong in Moo Shu Pork, but it is super common in a Hecai Daimao, which definitely means that this isn't Moo Shu Pork, but it's what my mom used to make, so to me it's very traditional. So as with pretty much any Asian noodle, so if you see me talking about Asian noodles, we don't want to use aggressive heat with Asian noodles, especially something as thin as vermicelli. So what I'm doing is I'm adding it to some boiled water. So that's a pot of boiled water, and then we're just going to give it a quick soak. Vermicelli is very delicate because it is very thin. I'm being careful not to overcook these. So if we were to throw this into a rolling pot of hot water, like in a stock pot, the way that you would approach Italian noodles, these would turn into mush pretty quickly. We don't want that. We want pretty tender and like roughly al dente noodles. So instead of doing it in a rolling pot of water, we're just doing it in hot water and then letting it kind of cook down and become tender on its own. So I'm agitating it just a little bit, maybe like a minute, maybe two, and then we're just going to let it sit for a second. I stream every night. So we're here every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30, Wednesdays at 6. Super frequently. Lately I've been streaming on Fridays and Saturdays, mainly because I have lots of time on my hand. But not always, depending on like how much time I have, I'll stream on Fridays and Saturdays. I am going to be streaming tomorrow, doing a Chinese dish called Chinese lion's head meatballs, which are basically Chinese meatballs in like a braising sauce. So I will be streaming tomorrow, not consistently every weekend, but definitely every Tuesday and Thursday, 6:30 PST, Wednesdays at 6. And if you're looking for the dishes that we're cooking, there's a schedule for everything that I cook. That's up on the YouTube channel too. So if you're following on YouTube already, you're already there. And on the channel, you can find a list of everything that we'll be cooking probably for the next couple of days. So, all right, so that should be good for our vermicelli. Really does not take very long for this stuff to cook through. I'm gonna dump this water. So again, unlike Italian cooking, we're not reserving any of that pasta water. Just getting as much of the moisture out as possible, and in it goes. And then I'm just going to give this a toss until it's combined, and that'll be it. So now you can definitely hear there is absolutely no sizzling left. That's a sign that there's no heat left in your wok. And that's because there's so much stuff in the wok right now. In this case, that's totally fine because we're also done cooking. But if at any point you hear your wok and it sounds like this, where there's no sizzling happening at all, that's a sign that you don't have enough heat going on. So it could mean a couple of things. In this case, it's totally fine because we're done cooking. But if you are still cooking and your wok sounds like that, that's going to be a big problem for heat retention. And that means that you're definitely on your way to a super mushy stir fry, which is not good. back over to our cutting board. Ready to plate this up. That's not going to be a big enough bowl. Alright, so next, the way that we're plating this is definitely comes from an Americanization that comes from the way that my mom made this. But we always used to eat these in like a big enchilada plate, which is definitely comes from the way that my mom used to think about getting two little kids to eat a big plate of vegetables, which is essentially making it look like an enchilada, because that's how you get a 10-year-old kid to eat a plate full of veggies. It's make it look like an enchilada and then covered in egg. Alright, so the very last thing we want to do before we move on is give your wok a nice clean down. So I say this at almost the end of almost every stream. When you finish cooking on your wok, the last thing that you should do before you move on, especially even if like there's food in front of you already and you're ready to eat, is clean your wok first, because it's much easier to clean a hot wok than it is to clean a cold wok. And that's because when your wok is still hot, you still have a super nice non-stick surface going on. So once it cools down, then it cools down, then you don't have that heat, which means that you don't have a non-stick surface anymore, which means if you try and clean your wok and it's cold, you're going to have to scrub quite a bit. And if you have like carbon steel wok like this, in this case, that means that you could potentially be scrubbing off a lot of seasoning, which is not great. So very last step, anytime that you're cooking in a wok, is clean it first. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do is top this with my egg. Goes on top. And that is it. So today I'm serving this with flour tortillas, because that's how I always knew how to eat Moo Shu pork, is with flour tortillas. If you can get your hands on it, they do make Moo Shu pork skins, and they basically look like egg roll skins. But they're super, super thin, and they're really annoying to try and eat with because they're so thin. So if you are using Moo Shu pork skins, I would recommend using 2 of them per dish because they're so thin. And at this point, it's essentially we're treating it like a taco at this point. So I'm going to start with serving spoon. I'm going to cut off a bit of egg here. And then we're going to serve. Nope. Yeah, that should work. And we're topping it all with a bit of hoisin sauce. That is it. So at this point, it's basically a taco. So we wrap it up. Use a little bit more. And that is it. So super common in America, you will see this eaten with flour tortillas. If you can find it and you live in Chinatown, it's also super common to get your hands on some traditional Moo Shu pork wrappers. They look like this. You will find that this stuff is super hard to eat with because it's really thin. So when I eat with actual Moo Shu pork wrappers, I usually have to eat with 2 of them at a time because they're so thin. And it's also super frustrating because they tear a lot. So I have pretty much every time I eat regular Moo Shu pork skins, at least one disaster in which the whole thing falls apart and I end up just eating scooping it up with my hands is because those skins are really, really thin. So if you are using regular Moo Shu pork skins, make sure that you double up on that stuff, or else it's going to break in your hands and it's going to be a real bummer. So that's my version of Moo Shu pork, which is technically not Moo Shu pork. It's a dish called Hecai Daimao. If you're interested in this particular recipe, I recommend hopping over to the YouTube channel where you can find recipes for pretty much everything that we cook. Pretty sure I didn't mess this up, so I'm pretty sure this is going to eventually become a recipe video that's going to pop up on our YouTube channel. If you're watching on YouTube, you are already there. That's the YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/WuCanCook. If you're watching on Reddit, that's the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. If you aren't subscribed already, I highly recommend hopping over if you're interested in cooking some of the stuff that I'm cooking. Or if not, if you're just interested in watching me cook more stuff, it's a fun place to watch fun and entertaining things to watch. Yeah, it's good. Let's see. Yeah, on the YouTube channel, we do new recipes every Friday. So yesterday we did a recipe for a Westlake soup, which is a Chinese egg drop soup with a couple extra steps. That was for a recipe for a restaurant, soup from a restaurant called Dragon House here in San Francisco. Lately I've been kind of cooking my way through a lot of local restaurant stuff and exploring like the reproduction of a lot of stuff for local restaurants here in Oakland and San Francisco. Before that, I was working my way through cooking basically the entire Panda Express menu, and it's kind of exploring what like Chinese American food looks like and why it looks the way that it looks. Chinese American food to me is super interesting because it's not Chinese food, it's basically American food with like a bunch of like weird Chinese tweaks. So it's really interesting to me to explore like why Chinese food looks the way that it looks in America. What did Chinese people do in order to make Chinese food palatable for Chinese American or like American palates, and like kind of like what are the elements that were changed in order to make it tasty for Americans, you know? So like lots of times you'll find like all of the sugar elements, all of the umami elements, especially like the saucy elements, are all cranked up to 11, and that's like what Chinese American food is like taking those three things and then turning the dial way up on all of those three things. And that's not really what Chinese food is. It's like Chinese food is not always, but oftentimes a lot more subtle than Chinese American food. So a lot of the recipes that we've been exploring on YouTube have to do with like exploring Chinese American food and seeing the way that like those recipes come together, especially things like Panda Express, and then sort of deconstructing it and taking another shot at like what it looks like if we were to assemble that recipe, but remove all of those American elements. So like dial back some of the sugar and replace it with the things that make Chinese food Chinese. So like replacing a lot of the sugars with like sweet and fermented sweet elements with things like fish sauce and black vinegar, stuff like that. And kind of taking a look at what that looks like when you leave out the Americanness of Chinese American food. So, yeah. So if you're interested in stuff like that, I recommend hopping over to YouTube. We were waiting for the first bite. I already took a first bite. I'll take a second bite though. Yeah. Yeah, so if you're interested in content like that, I recommend hopping over to the YouTube channel, checking some of that stuff out. Super fun place where we're doing lots of fun recipes that are really like iconic and critical to my childhood and things that I remember eating when I was a kid, things that I grew up eating a lot of. So I grew up eating a lot of this stuff because my mom used to make it a lot. Things like that, lots of stuff like that. So. If you're interested in cooking yourself, not just watching me cook stuff or just watching me cook more stuff on the internet, definitely hop over to YouTube. We're working our way to a 1,000 subscriber goal by the end of December. That's the big bar at the bottom of the screen. Pretty sure that we'll make it. Just have to keep streaming, I guess. So thanks everyone for tuning in. I will be back here tomorrow cooking a Shanghainese dish called lion's head meatballs. Lion's head meatball is a braised meatball that's braised in a wok with some vegetables, so in this case bok choy. So if you're interested, I recommend checking out that stream tomorrow too. We'll be back at 6:30 PST at the same time. So a couple questions. Well, am I using the wok to clean, or does it just say? Yeah, so it's just the frying oil. So that was grapeseed oil that I kind of gave it a swirl, and then just wipe it down just a tiny bit, so like maybe a teaspoon of oil. So we don't want to overwhelm the wok with oil, because otherwise the oil can, I didn't know this, but oil can also oxidize carbon steel if you leave too much of it in. So just a tiny bit, and then I'm wiping it down with a paper towel. Early Asian Americans and how they work. Resourced locally. Yeah, totally. So that's kind of like what I've been exploring, like the history of Asian American food. So a lot of like the Panda Express recipes and like the exploration of Asian American food is largely inspired by a documentary that I found on Netflix called The Search for General Tso's. Lots of people ask me about this documentary, which is really interesting because it's, I guess at its core is a documentary on the dish General Tso's chicken. But really what it's a documentary of is like Chinese American food, how it came to America, like why was food so critical to Chinese people becoming integrated into like American culture and American society in like the early 19th century. And like kind of exploring like a lot of that cultural history of Asian America and like seeing how the food of our like Chinese people was kind of adapted in order to like aid in the integration of Chinese people into American culture in like the 19th century. So super interesting. It's also like super interesting to me because like lots of times, most of the time, the food that I'm cooking is generally based out of something pretty traditional or like pretty traditional Chinese food. But oftentimes, a lot of the food that I cook has a lot of elements that are not like super traditional. So like what we're cooking today, a Hecai Daimao, is super traditional. But the way that it's plated and a lot of the way that it's prepared is not super traditional. It's pretty Americanized, and that's because I was taught how to do this from my mom, who lived in America after like the age of 16. So like a lot of the way that I understand how food works in like Chinese food is very like pretty based out of like traditional Chinese food, but at the same time like very, very influenced by living in America for all my life. So super interesting, and that's kind of like what we explore on the YouTube channel. So if you're interested in stuff like that, I recommend hopping to the YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/woocancook. Every small town in Canada has a Chinese family restaurant. Yeah, totally. Especially like Vancouver, lots of good Chinese food in Vancouver. I was there recently. Is it Vietnamese? I guess this would be technically is Chinese, so I think it comes from Cantonese cuisine. Don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure it's Cantonese. Pretty sure it's Cantonese. But it does, yeah. If you're asking, it does contain Vietnamese rice noodles, so vermicelli. I'm not really sure how that works. I'd probably have to ask my mom. My mom didn't clarify when I asked her. She didn't even tell me what noodles were in it. She told me that there were noodles in it, and then I made the leap that it was like, I'm pretty sure those were vermicelli rice noodles. And I did a little bit of research, and it does check out that the Hecai Daimao contains vermicelli rice noodles. A very interesting dish. Pork, no, it's a pork loin. So a pork chop. It's basically a boneless pork chop. I had some bone-in pork chops, but I'm saving it for a skillet pork chop instead, which I think is more appropriate. I feel like if you're stir-frying pork, you might as well just use boneless pork chop because you're going to chop it up anyway. So like the main reason to use a bone-in cut of anything, that includes like steaks, so like ribeyes and stuff, is that the bone retains more of the flavor and like juice. So when you cook a bone-in steak, very frequently that steak will be a little bit more juicy than a boneless steak because that bone is holding in a lot of the juice. In a case like this, because we're just chopping it up and throwing it in a wok, I really didn't see the point in like wasting a bone-in pork chop. I'd rather put that in a skillet. So I use boneless pork chops. But you don't need to use pork chops. You could use, I've done this with skirt steak too. It works really great too. So. American, yeah. So I live here in Oakland, and born and raised in Marin County, or born in Marin County, and then been in Oakland for the last 20 years now. My parents are Taiwanese, so I'm Taiwanese American, I guess. So. Cool. I think I got everyone's questions. Let me know if I missed any questions. Feel free to repeat them. I oftentimes miss questions because I'm facing the stove and don't see when questions pop up. And sometimes the window only has like like room for 10 questions, and sometimes I miss stuff. So if I missed a question, feel free to repeat it. I'll also do my best to circle back later and check on any questions that I missed and answer in a written form everyone's questions in case I missed it. If you haven't already, or if you're already there, or if you're not already there, definitely hop over to the YouTube channel and check out some of the stuff that's popping up on the YouTube channel. I also announce on YouTube everything that we're cooking in advance, so if you are interested in cooking alongside with me, that's always super fun when folks are cooking with me, and then we can talk about things that we messed up. So I forgot to blanch the noodles in advance today, so you'll notice that I had to hurriedly do our noodle blanch before the wok started drying up. So stuff like that, mistakes, they happen, and it's really fun to like explore the mistakes that other people make when they happen in real time. So yeah, so every time we stream, that information will definitely be on the YouTube channel at least 24 hours in advance, sometimes more, which should give you hopefully enough time to go out and buy the ingredients in case you don't have some of this stuff. Other than that, let me know if you have any more questions. Feel free to drop them in the comments if I missed anyone. My name is Wesley. This is Wok Cook. We'll be back tomorrow night, 6:30 PST, doing lion's head meatballs, or Shanghainese lion's head meatballs. They're super tasty, and I almost nailed it the first time that I tried the recipe that I had written, but I missed one ingredient, which was 5-spice powder. My dad told me that it's really important to Shanghainese meatballs, so you have to redo it. So we're redoing it tomorrow, but hopefully I don't mess it up. So, all right, see you soon.
Coming out of